Hey, it's Mazzy and welcome back to the channel. I'm going to talk about rock and roll and a series of 5 albums that were just reissued from 1970s, mostly one in 1986, from the comeback career, I think the first comeback career of Little Richard, one of the greatest rock and roll performers, writers, of all time. And I don't have to tell you the whole history of Little Richard, but let me go back a little bit. The records I'm going to talk about are the series from Reprise Records, his comeback, that Omnivore just reissued. There's 5 records here. They've been doing a reissue program of the last several years of Little Richard. And this is kind of a period of Little Richard that is unknown to some people, but there's some brilliant stuff here, and I'll get into those in a little bit. Obviously, I'm not going to do the whole dissertation and history of Little Richard, but he was signed to Specialty Records and then VJ Records. Now, these are not the Omnivores. These are earlier reissues of the VJ and Specialty things, and most people know that music. And of course, Good Golly, Miss Molly, and the wonderful songs like The Girl Can't Help It and Lucille and others. But my connection in terms of early knowledge is really with the Beatles, as it usually is. And those of you who followed me know that. Going back to Paul McCartney's rendition, the Beatles' rendition of Kansas City. And what's interesting about that, in the middle of that song, he breaks into this kind of medley. And of course, when I first heard it, I don't think I had heard Little Richard's version of Hey, 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 Hey. And Paul McCartney merges into Hey, Hey, Hey. The Kansas City song is written by Lieber and Stoller. And of course, Hey, 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 Hey is a Little Richard song. And apparently, after the fact, sometime later, they really kind of discovered that. I don't know if it was obvious or not. And finally, the split of the songwriting and publishing, and Little Richard got his fair share, if he still owned the publishing. Not sure about that one. But it wasn't initially. If you look on the early credits, it just says Kansas City, Lieber and Stoller. Later copies of those albums credit both Lieber and Stoller and Little Richard. What a great rock and roll singer. Singer, important composer. He wore his religion, and he comes out of the gospel area and kind of really crossed over and sang the music, the rock and roll music of the devil. So at the end of this video, there'll be a link through a video I did some years ago. And in fact, I might have revisited it several times because it's a music I just adore. Music really kind of commencing in 1968, 69 through about 73, maybe into 74, around this time. And I think I call that video The Gospel According to Rock and Roll, and it'll be linked here. There were a lot of white artists around this time, and you start with the spirituality, a little bit of the band, the 1968 Music for Big Pink, plus their Brown second self-titled album. Obviously the music of Delaney and Bonnie and Friends. There's a certain gospel sound to their thing. Later, music by Leon Russell and Joe Cocker of Mad Dogs and Englishmen. J.J. Cale to some extent. Even John Lennon with God as a Concept by Which We Measure Our Pain, and George Harrison with My Sweet Lord. Eric Clapton, his first solo album, who kind of went on tour with Delaney and Bonnie. There was a real kind of God squad of white musicians that were preaching the gospel, and not always overtly religious like maybe a Little Richard or other gospel singers would, but there was definitely a kind of coexistence with spirituality and rock and roll. But let's talk about these records again. And I've had the last couple weeks a chance to revisit these. This is his comeback record. 1970, he gets signed to Reprise Records, and he self-produces this record. This is a fabulous record. I think out of all these, this is the first one to get. Go grab this one. This is called The Real Thing, R-I-L-L Thing. Includes Freedom Blues, the opening track. This is a great sounding record. It's a tight sounding record. In terms of the Omnivore reissues, these are all on colored vinyl. I couldn't care less about colored vinyl. Some people do, but I think they're beautifully done, and the pressings are really nice. All of them have essays by Bill Dahl, but these are wonderfully done. This one is on pink vinyl. And let me talk first about the second track on here too, Greenwood Mississippi. There's a swampiness to that. And before I even read these credits and the whole liner notes here describing a little bit of the background, the history of Little Richard, there's a swampiness, and it's a very much like a Susie Q riff in that, and it's brilliant. There's a certain tightness to the recording, a tightness to the sound, rockin' sound with a way of music and a style of music that really fits around this time. Obviously in '69, Creedence had 3 hit records. Not that he's copying Creedence. Creedence had the essence of rock and roll and artists like Little Richard and others. And of course, they did Good Golly Miss Molly at some point too. But this is an amazing performance, an amazing, wonderful recorded record. And in a way, I kind of wish he continued producing this series of records himself. We'll get into that in a little bit. But that opening song, Freedom Blues, is just a really kind of dynamic, wonderful rock and roll song. He does reflect back in the sound of that he created in the 1950s, and there's a lot of retro feeling to it, but it's brought up, and it's not with any modern flourishes yet at this point. When we get into the 1980 album, there's a little more of that, which you have to kind of adjust yourself and prepare yourself for the way that was recorded with gated drums, things like that. There is one cover, the final cover is a great rockin' rendition of Lennon McCartney's I Saw Her Standing There. So it's great that you know of the Beatles and the Stones and all these rockers. So many have covered Little Richard over the years, and him coming back and doing one of those. But one of the things, also there's a Hank Williams cover called Lovesick Blues. And we'll get into that because this whole period of the gospel rock and rootsy and country music really was a part of the return of Little Richard in the 1970s. The one thing that surprised me, you turn on to side 2, the opening track is 10 minutes and 24 seconds, and it's literally a rock and roll, kind of a psychedelic, funky jam that would bridge, think Creedence Clearwater meets Funkadelic. And it works. I was amazed. I was surprised listening to that song, and I loved it on here. It's something that you wouldn't expect on a Little Richard album. Obviously, he's playing piano. You got this really great kind of funky, swampy, building bass thing in there. At the end, you have harmonica. You have these great saxophone solos and a killer left channel, like psychedelic, swampy guitar thing. Not quite as intense of the wah-wah thing you hear on Maggot Brain by Funkadelic, but it's something that could be right in there. And it would be totally a staple of FM radio around this time in 1970. I'm not quite sure why they didn't jump all over that. Maybe they did in some areas, in some markets, but I don't remember ever hearing that on FM radio back in San Francisco in 1970. But this is Little Richard, and this is, again, the real thing. This is the comeback. To me, this is an essential record of this period from the Reprise record years. So 1970, I think Reprise Records potentially could have been the perfect label for Little Richard. Of course, it started in the early 60s as Frank Sinatra's custom label to bring him away from Capitol Records and moving to Warner Brothers, making a custom label in Reprise. He brought in so many other artists, Dean Martin for one. But by the end of the decade, it became drenched in a lot of people, everyone from Randy Newman to Neil Young to great rock and roll stuff there. And so this might have been a great place. And I always considered Warner Reprise, and later it became WEA, as the real artist-friendly label. So I think it was a perfect place for him. So it's really interesting. After this self-produced debut, The Real Thing, recorded at Muscle Shoals, he gets H.B. Barnum, another producer, and does something, takes a kind of a U-turn, which not quite sure it was the right career move at the time in 1971, but it was a follow-up to his Reprise debut, and that is Little Richard, the king of rock and roll. Little Richard always had this outgoing, over-the-top head of rock and roll, the greatest rock and roll performer persona that he, self-described. That was part of his greatness, I think, and part of his shtick in a way, and especially coming back at this point. Remember, this is a point in rock and roll where, a lot of these early artists with whether it's Carl Perkins or Jerry Lee Lewis or Little Richard or Chuck Berry were revered in the 50s and revered by these 60s rock and rollers. And they were kind of left on the wayside until the late 60s into the 1970s, where they would do collaborations with a lot of the successful bands, and they had a bit of a comeback in their own right. This is interesting because this takes a different turn, and it's made up of pretty much all cover songs. The King of Rock and Roll opens up with this faux flown in crowd sounds. I think the crowd sounds are a disservice for this record. It's really interesting, but it takes away. Richard comes in as the preacher of rock and roll, the gospel, the leader of rock and roll, which makes it interesting. So it's something that probably on paper was a better idea than in terms of the performance, but their songs themselves are wonderful. He does a cover of Brown Sugar, not as good as the Stones version. He does Dancing in the Street, which is a pretty good version. Midnight Special, of course, a wonderful song, a song that Creedence Clearwater did an amazing cover on. And he actually does I'm So Lonesome I Can Cry, Hank Williams. You could hear and feel the percolation of his interest in country music around this time, which we'll get to in a little bit. There's also a cover, it ends the album with Born on the Bayou, the John Fogerty Creedence song. This record out of the series is the one that is puzzling. It's puzzling in the direction. Again, it has liner notes by Bill Dahl. This has a lovely white vinyl. Songs are great, but the influence and the production of those crowd noises and that gospel preaching is something that makes this probably a little subpar. It's the only one like this in the series. The music is great. That production style and that choice is something that I think in 1971 is somewhat questionable. Before I get to the third album that Reprise issued as one of my favorites, I need to kind of take a little side note. One of the records that is not part of this series that just came out in the past 6 months or so, Omnivore did reissue this, and it's an unreleased album that Reprise refused to release in 1972. And I heard it on digital. I have a digital version of this. I do not have it on vinyl. That's something I need to rectify. I actually went to my locals on Sunday and looked for a copy, couldn't find it. But this is called Little Richard, Southern Child. And Reprise even came up with this wacky cover art. And this is Little Richard's country album. Again, I think Omnivore released it 2 or 3 years ago. And it's something, if you see it, you should grab it because it's friggin' fantastic. And it's puzzling to me that in 1972, Reprise refuses, because Reprise was one of those labels, the Warner Reprise group, that were very artist friendly. I mean, shit, they put out what, 6, 7, 8 Randy Newman albums before he had a hit, Ry Cooder Records, Bonnie Raitt Records. They were the artist friendly label, Warner and Reprise. And it's puzzling to me. You know, they apparently they didn't think the audience was ready for a country record from Little Richard. I disagree totally. Think about this. I mean, this is like what, pre-Eagles maybe, but it was a time when, as I said, country gospel, and whether it's Delaney and Bonnie, whether it's the Flying Burrito Brothers in the late 60s, whether it's Graham Parsons, literally on Reprise Records, would put out a record in 1972 and 1973. And then Emmylou Harris and so on. We know where country rock came from. So I can't believe this is a country funk record. And it's really wonderful. So it's not in this series, but it is an Omnivore reissue. I suggest you go find this record. If you like country music with some funk and some balls in this, this is an incredible over-the-top record. And I mean over-the-top in the best of ways. It's so good. But then in 1973, I think, this comes out. The Second Coming. I think this is the most beautiful cover art of any Little Richard album. This is the one album that I had from way back when, and I really love this record. The cover art is by Dave Willardson. This has just some, again, cool rock and roll with a little swampy thing. He does revert to his sound. I mean, you're not going to get someone like Little Richard to do something completely different. He's not going to do, if he's going to do a concept album, he'll do it like that King of Rock and Roll, where it'll be about his music, himself, his persona. It's not going to be like a prog record or the Who's Tommy, where it takes this kind of storyline and runs with it completely different. That's not what Little Richard's about. It's about the core of rock and roll, his piano playing, his dynamic persona, his voice, his woos that he taught Paul McCartney. It's interesting when you look back on these rock and roll artists of the 1950s into the early 60s, whether it's Elvis or it's Johnny Cash or it's Little Richard, there's a gospel religious thing going on. There's a music of faith, and my guess, especially when I've heard interviews with Little Richard, there's a conflict of that, about the devil's music and that. Of course, this was great, but these weren't big hit records. I mean, they had a certain, minimal fan base. This is amongst my favorite as well. So this one is highly recommended. This is Little Richard's The Reprise Years, Setting the Woods on Fire. I love this artwork. Great artwork. Again, it continues with the Bill Dahl essays, liner notes. Don't you just miss liner notes on records? Beautiful Warner. Now this has the incredible label. Look at this label there. That's the killer label. I mean, it's about the music. I always pontificate it's the music first, but I do like great design. There's good pressings on here. And again, having these liner notes on here just really adds to it. Now what this is a version of alternative versions, instrumentals, that some of these have been released digitally in different forms. I don't have any of that. Two of the songs on here are from that aforementioned album, Southern Child, the country album. The record that Reprise Records didn't want you to hear in 1972. I still can't believe that Reprise nixed this. Now, who knows if it would have sold then, but that kind of music, that kind of mix of things was everywhere. And so for them, a label like Reprise and the Warner Group to not allow that to come out is ridiculous. They even made that crazy milking the cow cover art, everything. But two of those songs are on this record. You have In the Name, version 4, take 3, and you have Sneak the Freak. But there's a funkiness to that stuff, which is great. So this is one of the better of these Omnivore releases. I highly recommend this one too, but it's a really great series. Now let's cut to 1986. Again, Little Richard went to an interesting period of time, took a hiatus, took some time off, and that's something that's a constant in his career, but he would always come back, but he always questioned his love of rock and roll and his creation of rock and roll. And he would ask people things like, do you think my music is the devil's music? In 1986, this is one that is unusual. This was issued on Warner Brothers in 1986. I don't think it did that well. It has a lovely, again, insert photograph, yet another wonderful essay. They go again, these essays start with a sort of a setup biography, thinking that not everyone's gonna read every essay from all 5 of these releases, plus the earlier Omnivore releases. But so it gives you a little setup to flow into the current background of this particular recording. This one is on a blue vinyl, again, with this Omnivore label there. You do have a little bit of that gated drum reverb sound. I'm not particularly a fan of that usually, but if you like that 80s stuff and you're immersed into that, whether it's dance music and other, you have a little bit of that here. It still goes back to, like, he opens up Great Gosh Almighty, right in the pocket of what a Little Richard sounds like. Even the type of photography with that kind of that lighting thing, having represented photographers, it's almost like a strobe delay with their photography. I'm here to talk about art in all forms of it, even though the music comes first. But this is Little Richard, lifetime friend. Of course, you see him the current Little Richard looking back at the old 1950s, the young Little Richard and what he was about. So he does hark back to the music that he created in the 50s, but brings it to a sound of the 1986. Again, the 80s are a problematic time for me personally, for some artists and some bands. And every major band that I loved in the 60s into the 70s, for the most part, went about using this type of sound. That was the sound of the 1986. The nice thing is it isn't an absolute here. It doesn't flow over the entire album. And there's some great songs on here. But all these records, the thing about this entire series that Omnivore reissued, the Reprise years, the Warner years, is that Little Richard is not redefining himself and trying to do something new, trying to be a different artist like a David Bowie, or you wouldn't get that with the Rolling Stones, because they basically always did sort of the blues and the country blues and the rock and roll and the Chuck Berry stuff. That's all they did. They did it fabulously, but that's all they did. So every time when I have these debates, arguments about Beatles versus Stones, it's always the Beatles, because they would always evolve. Now, I love the Stones, but the Beatles did something different, and they were challenging everyone else, or challenging themselves. And Little Richard is not doing that. He's not doing something brand new. Johnny Cash always did Johnny Cash, yet his last, 15 years of his life, when he did the American recordings, really everything's were stripped back. He went back to the essence of the songwriting. That's not what this is about. I kind of wish there was a later thing where we could just have Little Richard and a piano doing his songs, totally alone, totally unplugged. That apparently, as far as I know, never happened. But this is a good record with the asterisk, the caveat of some of it has that 80s sound. There's a great song that was the closest to a hit on this, called Operator, which is a wonderful, a good song, and I think it actually works really well on this record. But again, this is probably my least favorite of the series. There are ballads on these records too. Not everything is bombastic 50s like tutti frutti rock and roll and that kind of sound of the Little Richard hits we know of the 1960s or 1950s. There's a great variety in here. There's the soul, the gospel soul, the rock and roll soul, the intensity of an artist still in his prime, but kind of was lost along the way, like a lot of these. Like even, Chuck Berry comes back and has a hit with a novelty song, My Ding-a-Ling. And of course, what's great about Chuck Berry or Bo Diddley, as much as you write you love those artists, and how can you not? In a way, one could argue they wrote the same song 300 times. Now, that's me as a composer, non-writer, kind of, sticking it or just kind of joking, making it lighthearted. But there is some truth that there's a sound that these artists had, and they were successful. Of course, when you hear Havana Moon by Chuck Berry, it's totally different than rock and roll music. So check out the 1970s Little Richard Reprise stuff. They're pretty cool. You got The Real Thing, Little Richard, with some great swampy gospel rock and roll stuff with a credible psychedelic 10-minute track. You got the crowd noises and the Little Richard, the king of rock and roll. He literally is the king on this record. Some interesting cover tracks. You got this beautiful record. You got this, The Second Coming. I think it's 1972, 73. With the best cover of any Little Richard album. You have the great comp of unreleased tracks from the Reprise years that were released digitally. If you had those digital recordings from several years ago, you might have those. And you have Little Richard Lifetime. This is the 80s, and the final complete album. He did some songs here and there on various albums and contributions after this. And then lastly, you should check out Little Richard's Southern Child, that 1972, unreleased until Omnivore released it several years ago, with that shit-ass cover art. I can't believe Reprise wouldn't put that out. What are they thinking? Anyway, thanks for watching again. Mazzy loves you.